We certainly want our companies to grow, to gain revenue, to go raise funding if that's the right path for them. But we're less concerned about just pushing towards an outcome where their valuation has increased 5x at the end of the program.
Welcome to another episode of Forging the Future, and I'm here talking to a man who knows a little about cars, motorcycles, selling software, and most importantly, helping startups and ecosystem building. So I'd like to welcome Jon Nordby, head of Texas at MassChallenge's, to the show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thanks for being here, Jon. Yes. So Jon, how did you get here today? No. How did you get to Houston? Tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so it's very non-traditional. Born and raised in Houston, on the southwest side of town, Sharpstown area. My parents actually still live there.
You know, I actually, when I first moved to Houston 35 years ago, lived in Sharpstown.
Yeah, I moved in 40 years ago when I was born. So it was pretty close. But yeah, born and raised in Sharpstown. Parents still live there. Grew up in that side of town, and went to high school there. It was funny, coming out of high school, there wasn't nearly as many options, I think, then as there are now, and not a lot of exposure to things like entrepreneurship or certainly no talk about startup development. So it's funny, I actually left high school, went to college because that's what you do. But I had zero understanding as to why I was doing that.
Was that here in Texas?
It was. I went to U of H actually for a semester. Mm-hmm. We very quickly agreed that I probably wasn't a great fit because I didn't know what I was doing and they didn't know what they wanted to do with me. So I actually just started working. I went into some trades, did some manual labor for a labor union, worked on cars for a while. Actually went to a different school here in Houston to learn how to work on cars, and went and became a technician for Audi for a few years. Which was super fun, worked at a dealership, but it was at that environment. So one of the dealerships that I worked at, it was a brand new dealership. I got to be employee number 2, and it was like 6 months that I got to hang out before we ever had a car to work on. So I got this like really interesting experience of seeing this business grow from the ground up and just being exposed to like this totally new world of building a business and what that meant and what that looked like and like how everything operated, and was just lit like a passion in me to do that. So learned that for a while. That was actually up in Dallas, moved back down to Houston. Friend of mine had a motorcycle dealership. It's actually a car repair shop that we turned into a motorcycle dealership. I took all of the stuff that I had learned from my time in Audi, and I talked to him at length about creating a sort of a wholesale business for motorcycles. He loved the idea so much that instead of giving me the money, he made me a partner in his business. We put 25 grand in a bank account and started buying and selling bikes and setting up finance for it, and turned around a little over a year later and did $1 million in sales, was the largest pre-owned motorcycle shop in the city. Had a long clientele list. It was super fun, but also like really seasonal.
What was the name of it?
Grand Prix Motoring.
Okay.
Down on Richmond and Fondren. We were there for about 10, 15 years. And super, super fun. Learned a whole other like skill set there too on like starting the business from scratch, the finance side, all that kind of stuff. And then ended up doing some other small business stuff. I ran a cleaning company in Dallas, a janitorial service that was more of a turnaround. Did some consulting for like an IT company and some other things, a bunch of like really entrepreneurial stuff. And my wife, now girlfriend at the time, said, "Hey, this is awesome. Love that you're learning a lot, like getting that, hard knock education, but why don't you get a real job?" And so, as any good entrepreneur would do, I went into sales after that because that was the most natural fit. And when I actually went to sales, one of the things I wanted to look for was a place where I could like really be challenged and would train me really well. Cause up to that point I was pretty much self-taught on everything I did. And so I actually went to work for Aramark, which had the number 2 ranked sales program in the country behind Xerox. Cause it's really hard to sell these 5-year contracts for laundry service essentially. So learned a ton there. Ended up getting recruited over to into the HR technology world, into selling software. So places like Career Builder and Monster and another company called CareerArc. That was about 6 years of my tenure selling software and doing solutions architecting for them. But the entire time that I had these like corporate jobs, I was advising startups and sort of getting more engaged in the startup world here in Houston and learning more about like what needed to happen in terms of like developing those startups and like what was missing for them. And ultimately somehow landed over at the Greater Houston Partnership because I wanted to make a change out of sales, and they were doing some really interesting initiatives around talent attraction that lined up with what I was doing. So ran an initiative there for about a year, which was great. We had actually like a 3-year work plan that we completed in about a year. And so sort of a year, and I was like, all right, what do I do now? And it happened to be this great platform and a great time in the development of Houston's ecosystem, where there was a lot of desire to support startups. There was more of a community forming around the startups. This was about 2015 or so, 2016. And more people that wanted to have a conversation around what innovation, adoption, and creation meant from the government side, from corporations, from universities. Very much helped that it was on the heels of that big energy downturn where oil traded negative and everybody kind of freaked out because you need a good, crisis to get people engaged in innovation. So on the heels of all that, we launched the Innovation Initiative, which then
Who is we?
So we had a group of folks that we sort of called the Innovation Roundtable. And these were conversations that some I got to join, some I got to lead. There's a lot of people that were, out and about in the ecosystem, folks like Emily Keaton, Blair Guru, Gaurav Kandawal, that were actively trying to build spaces for entrepreneurs and trying to push forward conversations around getting engagement from corporations and attracting venture capital.
Because this was in the HTC days, right?
Yeah, so HTC was still around then.
Prior to like Station Houston and
so actually
Exponential.
Yeah, so HTC was around and I think was looking for what their next big iteration was going to be. When we were first kicking this roundtable off, Station was just launching, which was great. And so got to know Grace and JR through that and watched that sort of grow and develop and actually really great stories and lessons in like how important community and like the people connection is to a thriving ecosystem. Because those early days of Station, it was hard to find an organization that nailed it like they did when it came to community. So that was those early days. And out of that roundtable, the sort of net result was we created a study with Accenture to talk about what an innovation economy needed in Houston and how to move forward. And that's what helped us spawn sort of early ideas for the Innovation District, for Houston Exponential, the HX Fund of Funds. And then somehow through all of that work, also identified these gaps that we needed around acceleration capacity, which led us to MassChallenge. And so through that windy road, that's how I ended up here, essentially.
That's pretty fascinating. I mean, back then there just wasn't a whole lot, right? So I mean, it sounds like it was pretty obvious to you, like it was to me, that there wasn't a whole lot of support for small businesses, especially technology businesses.
Yeah, like I remember in my days when I was doing a lot of advising, probably 2012 to 2015-ish, there was maybe half a dozen startups that were teams that I would either meet through like AngelList or LinkedIn or other sort of activities. None of them were in Houston. I don't say none of them. Most of them were not in Houston. There was a couple that were. But time and time again, I would get recruited to like help them in an advisory role for a really specific need that they had.
Who was recruiting you? Like,
typically it was founders.
Founders that you knew?
Yeah.
Network. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so, but there wasn't a lot of that happening in Houston. There just wasn't a lot of high growth startups. And the ones that were here that I had a chance to get to know some of them or be a part of their journey, it was pretty apparent that you were going to hit a wall really quickly, right? I actually remember this was really telling when we were doing a lot of our research in the Greater Houston Partnership days. We talked to an angel investor that was locally. And I think at the time, I don't want to misquote this, so I'll leave his name out of it in case I do misquote this, but I'm pretty sure at the time he was one of the most active angel investors in Texas. And I think the second most active behind Mark Cuban. And he was here in Houston. And I remember him specifically saying he was looking at a deal for a Houston-based company. And so this was a Houston angel talking to a Houston startup. And the angel told the founder, I will make you an investment if you move to Austin because you'll never get what you need in Houston, right? It was just resource constraint. And these are two people that loved Houston and they wanted to be here, but they just knew that they wouldn't get the resources they need.
And this was years ago.
Yeah, that was back, if I had to guess, 2014 or so, 2015.
Do you think that's changed now?
I think for some it has, right? And I think for certain scales it has. Like those earlier stages of development, there's a lot more resources now. There's a lot more community. There's a lot more desire to engage. I also think the investment landscape, which drives a lot of like where the resources go to, has changed drastically in COVID, and geography matters a lot less now than it did in 2019. So I think really good capital, really smart capital is following really great deal flow. And that really great deal flow is coming from places that are very non-traditional. And so there's not as much pressure for somebody in a city like Houston, or to be fair, a city like St. Louis or Atlanta or Miami, right? These other markets that we've seen sort of explode lately. There's not as much pressure for them to move and be close to that capital. So I do think that it's gotten easier. But I always temper those statements and those answers because we still got a long way to go, you know, and there's definitely a ceiling that you get to where it does become hard to find the type of talent at the scale that you need, or the type of mentorship, or the type of like access to customers in a city like Houston. So,
yeah, I don't know why that perception exists per se, because if you look at like Texas Instruments, right, you know, which is really at the forefront of the semiconductor industry, back when there wasn't all the other semiconductors. I mean, they really grew that, and it's a huge business, right? Similarly, like Compaq, one of the fastest growing startups ever, big Houston success story, scales up to tens of thousands of people with a campus here in Houston. You've got Dell, for example, you know, lots of people in Austin, and I can go on and on about that. So, I mean, these startups have actually taken off, found the talent, and scaled in Texas, you know, in a very technological way, right? But then there's still this perception of, well, I can't find the talent I need in Houston or something.
Well, you know, I
don't agree with it, because I'm with you, because I think the world actually is more flat than it ever was. And like with soft tech, I mean, we have resources worldwide. So nowadays, you don't even need to have them be local. You need to get something off the ground. I've got talent for you, and it doesn't, you know, and I'm here in Houston, by the way.
And so I think that's the big shift, right? And this is why I'm so bullish on Houston specifically, Texas in general, and then I would say any developing ecosystem outside of the coast, is because, so I love the book, The Third Wave of the Internet by Steve Case, right? If you haven't read it, it's awesome. He really describes like that first generation of companies, like he talked about Sun Microsystems, Texas Instruments, Compaq. They were solving really hard. I mean, these companies were literally creating the internet, right? They were creating the way, like a drastic shift in the way people communicate. And in order to take advantage of that, it was a massive amount of collaboration, a lot of universities, governments, corporates working together, right? Then you sort of had that foundation established, and you got into this like second wave, as he calls it, which is the ability to reach customers instantly overnight, right? This is the rise of two kids in a garage that could create these unicorn companies, right? Awesome. But I would say not suited to what we do in Houston, and not suited to what like most of the middle of the country does. And now we've kind of, as Steve Case would say, we're sort of entering this third wave, and he sort of predicted it around 2017, 2018. I think we're starting to see the effects of it now, where we as humans are far more interested in solving really hard problems that matter, not so much about like the next Uber for my cat food, right? Or like something that solves a really small problem. Like we really care about things like energy, healthcare, sustainability, things that are going to solve like these massive problems. And when you think about the resources of a city like Houston and the capabilities it has, like we're well positioned there in terms of like the raw resources. And I think that we're squarely at the beginning of this generational shift now, where we're going to see the types of innovations that come out of a city like Houston take advantage of those resources, and take advantage of the lessons that have been learned and developed and sort of perfected through those first two generations of startup creation. And we're going to see the types of startups that are going to be hypergrowth are not going to be these small consumer-driven applications. They're going to be, I think, partnerships, again, with universities, governments, corporations, studios that have great and sort of vast computing capabilities to solve for these like really hard things, right? And so that's, I think, the generational shift that we're in the middle of, and is, I think, positioned well for some of the influx that we're starting to see now in Houston.
I think Houston is positioned to solve some of those bigger problems that a lot of places aren't. And then, you know, with the Texas Triangle, I think it's going to be a surprise to everyone when we kind of zoom past. I think is what's going to happen.
I think so.
I don't really understand on the coast what's going on in the middle here. And I think there was an article recently by, I think S3 Ventures said that Houston's going to be the number 2, or at least the Texas Triangle is going to be number 2 for startups within the next 50 years or something like that. But I'm like, hey, I believe that. Texas is number 1. Let's go for that. But
well, I believe it. And I think it'll actually happen fast, right? Because this shift both in like startup development, like this whole third wave shift that Steve Case talks about. And then I also think sort of parallel to that, we're on a generational shift in how venture is operating, and how like incentives are being aligned to solve problems and to create startups. And I've got a much longer thesis on this, but I think the net result is that startups are going to, over the next 20 years, need to develop close to problem sets. And there's a lot of problems that we have access to in the Texas Triangle and Houston specifically, and not because we're screwed up, but because we just have these massive industries that are solving these really big challenges. And it's going to be far more important for these founders to be closer to the problems and be more problem centric than it is for them to be close to the capital or close to just the talent or the perception of talent or whatever that is, right? For all the reasons we talked about. So as long as we have those major industries here and we have the access to those, that infrastructure that is sort of housing those problem sets, I think that's what's going to position us well for hypergrowth in the future.
Is that the Mass and Mass Challenge, or is that Massachusetts?
It is. No, it's so when I joined in 2019, I was really clear, this is in my contract, we can no longer call it the Massachusetts Challenge. It is, we solve massive challenges. I'm joking, kind of. But we do call it, we have pivoted off of the original from 2009 being formed in Massachusetts. We have for the last 5 years or so had that as a tagline, that we solve massive challenges.
I like dual meanings, right? I mean, it makes sense. That's your pivot, right?
Exactly.
I also don't know what the correlation between Massachusetts and Texas is, right? I mean, because it's basically we got Mass Challenge here, we got Greentown Labs here, right? They're both coming down from Boston, and they're here in the Texas ecosystem, so they see something happening here,
I think they
right?
do. I think there's also like this interesting kinship that happens. I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, right? But so Boston and Houston in particular, they have a lot of similarities in terms of like the types of industries that we support, the types of like problem sets we've been working on for a long time, a lot of energy, a lot of healthcare, a lot of government contracting, right? A lot of like federally supported stuff, a lot of things in energy. And I think that like the folks in Boston definitely view everything below Boston as like their redneck cousin, which is fine. And we sort of view everything above Texas or outside of Texas as like the uppity, doesn't understand, like Ivy League folks, right? So there's always that like interesting tension, but there's always this like, you can spend a lot of time in Boston, there's always this like really intense respect for the types of things that happen in both markets and how they happen, right? Like there's definitely a much stronger research base up there just because of their infrastructure. But we get shit done here that not a lot of places in the world can get done, right? And so I think that relationship has been interesting to see over the years kind of develop. And I think there's also just a recognition, like we mentioned before, of the amount of problems that exist and the access points that exist to industry in a state like Texas is just a massive opportunity to unlock that potential for innovation creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what it is. I mean, there is some kind of parallel, like the twins or something, but I remember going up to the lab up in Cambridge that Compaq had. It was an R&D center lab. So Compaq, being based here in Houston, had a lab up there. And they might have gotten it through an acquisition or something. But then also, oddly, I'm a GP in Softtech Ventures. My other GP is from Boston.
Yeah.
I mean, there just seems to be like a kinship. And both places recognize things like fintech, medtech, et cetera, right? So medtech's pretty big up in Boston, as it is down here in Houston. So maybe talk a little bit more about Mass Challenge and what you're trying to do with your particular model, because it's different from ours. You don't take equity. I don't get that, but hey,
I know. Some days I don't either. Some days I don't. It's an interesting model, right? So we're a nonprofit. We don't take equity. We don't charge the startups anything. So as a business model, it's really hard because we're constantly trying to raise money and trying to bring in federal contracts or supply our corporate partners with the types of like innovation creation they need to kind of keep the machine running. So that's the challenge that we're always constantly facing. The impact, though, that we're able to create is a bit different, right? So when you remove maybe a better way to say this is when you align the incentives for the impact that we want to create with the incentives of just helping any startup anywhere in the world that's got a great idea, launch and grow and scale, we have sort of different outcomes that we work towards. And I'm being a little ambiguous here, but so maybe I'll tell you my story, that the thing that attracted me to Mass Challenge is one of the startups that I was advising years ago was this awesome HR technology company called Hireable. We did a thing where we would take an employee referral. We would go scan people's LinkedIns, and we would, through that employee base, make recommendations of who they should send that open requisition to. And as they forwarded that on through the different nodes in the network, we would then split that employee referral across all those nodes, and everybody would get paid when somebody got hired. Turned out to be super, super effective at finding really, really hard to find talent. People were getting paid on it. It was great. We got accepted into an accelerator on the West Coast. It was an amazing opportunity, a great team. But we didn't know this. Hindsight's always, much better on this, but we didn't know it at the time, but we were just not at the right place and the right scale to go to an accelerator. So once we got in, the thing that we were hyper focused on was going and acquiring customers to increase our revenue, which we did. We got some really big corporate customers. We signed initial contracts, initial LOIs. 6 months post accelerator, though, we ran into a bunch of technical problems with integrating with their software and things that we probably should have been working on in the early days and we didn't do, right? And to me, that sort of solidified that accelerators, especially equity-based accelerators, they are incredible tools for a company that's in the right place of development, the right stage of growth, and the matches, right? Whatever that value exchange is between the startup and the accelerator, like equity for knowledge typically, when that's in sync, it's an amazing relationship. When it's a little out of sync, though, it's detrimental to the startup, to the idea, to everyone. So the thing that was always compelling to me about MassChallenge is the no equity model means that we can take a little bit of a different approach. We certainly want our companies to grow, to gain revenue, to go raise funding if that's the right path for them. But we're less concerned about just pushing towards an outcome where their valuation has increased 5x at the end of the program and 10x in 2 years. We want those companies to grow and be sustainable and grow as fast as they can so that those revenues and the investment that they're getting is sort of feeding that machine so they can continue to create the impact. And what that means at its core is we feel like we're doing a good job when we accelerate the founder. And if we do that well, then the startup kind of becomes the vehicle that we're measuring success by. And in that scenario, it's very acceptable for that startup to fail, for it to pivot, for the founders to learn a lot and go on and do something else. Though we definitely try to de-risk that early on. So sort of realigning that incentives also gives us the ability to think about acceleration differently. And so we will accept in most of our programs, any startup anywhere in the world solving any challenge. We run about 20 different accelerators a year. Roughly 550 to 600 startups will come through those programs this year. And so they're all different scales and sizes and industry clusters. But for the most part, we're not limited on who we're looking for, where they need to come from, like what stage they're in. We're just looking for really great ideas that can create massive impact.
How many apply out of that 500?
That's a good question. We have a slightly less than a 10% acceptance rate, sort of broadly across the board. So we'll take in around 6,000 to 7,000 applications is what we would anticipate this year.
And what are they attracted to? Are you giving them money, access to investors, mentorship? How does it work?
Mostly it's mentorship and the knowledge. I mean, and I will say, this is probably gonna get me in trouble with my folks at MassChallenge, but I say this all the time. The knowledge that we provide is it's not different than what you're going to read out of the Lean Startup, or we actually subscribe to a method of thinking called the Lean Stack, which is a guy out of Austin, which we love. You can watch YouTube videos on it. Like, you can find the information out there. The real magic happens because it's being delivered by mentors. So we have roughly 4,000 to 5,000 experts that will engage with our program on an annual basis all around the world. Some of them are certainly serial entrepreneurs, some are investors, but the larger majority of them are subject matter experts out of industry. And there's a real sort of value exchange that happens there where they learn a lot about the startup and the industry that is being sort of innovated in, they being the experts. And then the startups get sort of this access point into sort of real-time knowledge of what's happening in those industries. And so the attraction for the startups is definitely access to that mentor network. That being said, we've got several hundred investors in our investor database that receive deal flow newsletters from us. They engage on a regular basis. We do hold an annual awards program. So once you go through one of our accelerators, you're eligible to apply to that. So we'll give out some non-dilutive grants there. But the real attraction is being able to build the network through the mentor pool.
So Mass Challenge, it's in Boston, right? And then it's also here in Houston, and there are other locations. When you say 500, 600 startups going through the program, those aren't all in Texas.
No, not all in Texas, no. So we have, most of our people are in Boston. We've got the second sort of largest grouping of our employees is here in Texas, mostly Houston and Dallas. But we have, we run programs currently in Texas, Boston, Mexico City, Switzerland, Lucerne, Switzerland, and Jerusalem, Israel, and then another between 13 to 15 countries this year will run small scale boot camps in or some version of our program in. And those span typically through Middle East, Europe, and South America. So we'll run some version of those all over the world. Now, a lot of our programs are still somewhat virtual. But we'll have in-person components that are a part of those programs that happen in our various hubs and spaces around the countries or around the world, I should say.
When you say somewhat virtual, is it mostly virtual at the moment? Or?
Yeah, it depends on the program. Some of our programs have now gone back to fully in-person. So you have to be there for the entire duration of the program.
Which is how long?
Depends on the program. Like our Switzerland program, I want to say is 3 months long right now. And so they're fully in-person in Switzerland. A lot of our smaller scale programs that'll run 6 weeks to 2 months. There's normally a in-person component at the beginning and the end, but most of the content is delivered virtually. This large scale early stage program we're about to kick off, we're having the big kickoff in Dallas. Everybody will be there for that for a week. There'll be some touch points throughout the program, and then in October there'll be a finale as well. So that's kind of been the hybrid model we've been in post-COVID. But I think we're slowly and hopefully quicker moving back into fully in person because that is proven to be exceptionally valuable to our founders and to our community.
So 5 years ago, there really wasn't much, right, available to founders, and now there's, I think, quite a lot, even in Houston, right? And I think one thing that startup founders don't realize is they can go through more than one of the programs, right? So we've had a couple startups that have done both Mass Challenge and Startup Venture Studio.
Yeah.
And then, especially when it's non-dilutive, and then you go through, we've also seen that also with Y Combinator and 500 Global and Techstars, startups coming through and then coming through our program. And so, but I'm trying to encourage startups is that there are tools available and you can make use of them. They're not all competing.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things that we've seen is, and it's kind of frustrating too, when I go back and do the calculation on the 5,700 or so alumni that we have now, if we would have taken warrants or even just a small percentage of equity from them, like it's a little mind-boggling as to like the position that the organization could be in now and the amount of impact we could have. But it absolutely would have changed the trajectory of like the type of impact we'll make, the type of founders we'll help. So like I'm actually curious, the startups that like we've seen that have graduated from our program, gone to yours, like they go through very different, they come to us for very different reasons, right? So like, I don't know, like why do you think they go through those different like models?
Well, I think in our case, what I was trying to solve with the Venture Studio is what I saw was a lack of help in getting things built, right? For one thing. And second, everyone would, for example, like we talked about getting a pitch deck or something like that done. That's one thing that's useful. And what I was trying to do is say, well, these startups that are coming to us to SoftTech that want help with services, but they didn't have any money, right? And so we had to turn them away, come back when you have some money. But we thought, well, what if we create a venture fund that actually gives them some money, but then not only that, give them some mentorship, like a Techstars program. But more importantly, the piece that I saw was missing was helping them actually get things built, right? Instead of saying, well, you need to go hire a guy from Facebook or Google or whatever and cobble together a team and try to get a POC or MVP built, instead of leveraging a services business that can come in and use the expertise of multiple years of building product to help them get their MVP or POC built, right? And I didn't see that out there.
Yeah.
So when I was an entrepreneur in the beginning, it was just like, I think Score was the only thing. And it was very business focused, but not anything about technology and how to do the networking and things like that. So now there are more areas where you can go and meet other founders and have those collisions and meet investors. And that really wasn't there before. But
it's funny. I'm laughing because I'm having like vivid flashbacks of like when we launched Mass Challenge and we're starting to build the mentor pool initially. And you'd get these folks that would show up with like the best intentions, and they would be some version of a service provider, to be like fractional CFOs or lawyers or whatever. And they would say like, I really love this space, and I know that startups can't pay. So, I'll give them some services for like being an advisor, or like take some equity here and there. It's not a bad value exchange, but they typically disappeared after 6 months because like you can't make any money on this, right? Because the startups don't have any money, and they're not really great at like selecting those things. So it's not, from what I've seen, it's not real common to have a model like that is like has longevity. And I think typically because it doesn't have the venture fund behind it, right? But that's also interesting to me that you're able to like take a bet on a company, a fairly sizable bet on a company that doesn't have a product. So like for us, we think about it as sort of the common good, right? It's okay if the product fails. It's okay because we're accelerating the founder. We want to create this like culture of innovation, but we're also selecting for teams that are fairly self-aware. They know what their goals are. They're in love with the problem, and there's going to be something there that we can work with, right? But ultimately, if they fail, we're not losing anything other than a metric, right? So we can risk a little bit more.
Take me through that selection process, because I understand how it works. Just like you said in a venture fund, like I'm making a bet on this company because it looks like it's going to 100x my investment. What you're saying is you get, tens of thousands of applicants or whatever.
Yeah.
You've got 200 in your last batch out of, 5,000 applicants. I don't know how many it is, right? So how did you pick those 200 if it's not like, well, these are going to, is it just the greater good or,
Yeah. So,
how do I win on that?
Yeah. So the way we think about it is, so first, the big distinction is that our community does all of the selection. So as a
Who is the community?
Those are our mentors, our experts, right? So these are the 3,000 to 5,000 or so. So we have a lot of terms for this, but we call them experts. So if somebody goes to masschallenge.org today, you can sign up to be an expert. As an expert, there's a couple roles you can play. You can be a mentor in one of our programs, which has a bunch of different subcategories of like how you would mentor the startup. You could be a speaker, or you could be a judge. And our judges do all of the selection for us. So typically we have 2 rounds of judging. So this big early stage cohort that will kick off, we took in around 2,000 applications for it. The first round of judging, each application gets passed between 5 to 10 judges. They give their feedback on just the paper version of the application. We combine all those scores. We do a lot of sort of math on the back end around like who the judge is, how harsh they are, that kind of thing.
What are they scoring though?
Yeah. So what we're looking for, what we tell the judges to look for is we want things that are going to create impact, right? Now, we have a sort of minimum threshold. So the company has to be below $1 million in revenue. Did I get that right? Yeah. Below $1 million in equity investment, below $2 million in revenue. So as long as they're not above that, they're eligible for the program. The judges, what we're telling them to look for is we're looking for companies that can create massive impact. And the way we define impact is could be very traditional social impact, but it could also be just like impact to an industry, highly disruptive, able to create a lot of jobs, but something that is going to be highly impactful. We also tell the judges, because they're so used to these settings being all about like making venture decisions, investability is incredibly important, but it's important insofar as we want ventures that can go on to create money or create wealth, to create revenue, to create the income they need to continue to grow that impact. If venture is the right avenue for them, awesome. If non-dilutive funding is the right avenue until they get customers, and we have plenty that do that, that's a great option as well. So investability is important insofar as they've thought it out, but it's not the top criteria for us, right? Top criteria for us is it the right team creating the right amount of impact? And then we sort of define impact loosely, I will say, because depending on the program, that can take on different meanings. So that's what the judges are looking for. Basically, is this something, another sort of litmus test I give them is this a company you would want to spend your time with? Like, would you want to be an advisor to this company? And that's typically like a more meaningful, like, yeah, I'd commit time to this because I believe in the mission. I believe in what they're doing. I think this is the right team. The other thing we ask them is we want the startups to tell us what they think they're going to get out of Mass Challenge. And if they tell us like, we know everything about startup development, we're really just here to be connected to your investors, probably not a good fit, right? If they tell us we're at this certain stage, we're 3 technical founders, we really need to understand marketing strategies, go to market, we think you have some mentors, that's an awesome fit for us, right? So we're looking for that fit and for impact. And so the judges will assess that paper application in the first round and typically will knock out 50 to 60% of applicants on that alone. And then we go into the second round of judging, which is a 20-minute pitch to a panel of judges. When we ran that for this cohort, it was 2.5 weeks, around 500 startups that pitched over 2.5 weeks, morning and afternoon. I mean, just all day long. Super fun because you get to see a lot of really interesting things. But it's funny that the ones that tend to score lower on paper actually score pretty well live, and sort of vice versa, right?
How big of a panel is that?
The judging panels run anywhere from like 4 to 7 typically.
It's 4 to 7 people, and it's the same 4 to 7 are looking at all 500.
No, oh God, no, goodness, no. We'll run 3 or 4 panels, morning and afternoon, different judges every day for 2.5 weeks. So we'll have several hundred judges throughout that process.
I see.
And those judges will give us their feedback and their scores, and we'll weigh all that against a number of options. Like, if you're just kind of a jerk and you think everybody sucks, we'll take that into account. If you're like the nicest person in the world, you're like, everybody deserves a chance, we're going to take that into account too. So we weigh all those scores out, and then the net result at the end of that is we'll take essentially the top roughly 10% of the total applicant pool.
So after the mentors do that 2 phases, and when you say we, who is that? Like leadership team at MassChallenge's or something?
Yeah, basically whoever's running that program, which is typically the leadership team. And normally what we do is just look at the scores. It's normally a pretty consistent cutoff. There's normally like a pretty big gap between the top, roughly like that 10% of that applicant pool, and somewhere else. Sometimes it's 7%, sometimes it's 11%, but normally there's a pretty distinguishable gap between those scores, and we say that's the natural cutoff. So we'll take everybody above that. So, and I will say that's the other nice thing about having the no equity piece behind us. We're not having to force a certain size of cohort to fit like a deployment thesis. So if we wanted to take 300 startups into this cohort, could. If we wanted to scale that back to 50, we could, right? And that doesn't screw with our return rates or calculations or any like sort of metrics we're trying to hit there. So we look for those natural cutoffs, we look for the right fit, and then we go from there. And then
300's a lot.
300's a lot. It is. But like the other thing is this is another way our program is different because of the scale that we operate at, and because it's all mentor driven. As a staff, it's a lot, but honestly, like once we get above about 50, it's kind of the same amount of work. We're scheduling the same amount of meetups, the same amount of content. It's really just managing those mentor interactions, and it's really teaching the startups and the founders how to take advantage of the tools that are in front of them. And it sort of holds true whether it's a MassChallenge tool or not, right? I'm less concerned with like tracking each founder and their individual progress through the program and coaching them one-on-one. I'm more concerned with giving them the tools to like be a great mentee, to find a great mentor, to get the really basics of like understanding innovation accounting and lean startup development and those sort of basic tools that they can apply broadly, and so that they can go out and sort of help themselves.
What's still missing in Houston?
It's funny. We've been asking this question for 10 years, right? It's like, what do we need? I don't know. I think we're always going to be missing something, right? Is the baseline. I don't think there's ever an end game where we're going to like all wake up one day and go, shit, we did it. We're here. We've arrived. You've got everything you need at your fingertips, right? I don't think that's the case. So I think there's always something missing. The standard answers, depending on who you talk to, will be access to more venture capital, more acceleration capacity, more startup development organizations. I think all of that's sure. Like we need that. More of that's nice. More of that's good. To me, though, I think the thing we're still trying to nail is this culture piece, right? It's this, like when you go to markets that have been doing this for a long time, even developing markets like Denver or Miami, like it's just a different feeling. When you talk to somebody that is a 20-year corporate executive, they still get it, right? They still understand that there is we're at a point in time where innovation creation is definitely going to happen faster outside of those corporate constraints, and they understand the innovator's dilemma a bit more, and they know how to, maybe not fully, but there's at least like an awareness of the need to go externally to find that innovation. And that means you have to support those communities in whatever it is they need in that time. And I don't think we're quite there yet. There have been major strides over the last few years, and I think we're seeing a lot of those great results. So I don't want to discount that at all. But I think the thing that is still missing is just that cultural piece that kind of takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of inspiration. It takes people seeing like a cart.com grow out of nothing and turn into a unicorn, right? It takes multiple of those things happening, I think, before you just start to really internalize the fact that every industry can be disrupted. There's lots of problems out there that we can solve. We don't have to be okay with the status quo. And then that culture just starts to permeate everything that we do.
Are you saying it's a culture of being at a large company like a BP or an Exxon or something and being willing to quit your 20-year job and join a startup in order to make a difference?
I think that's part of it, right? I think, my other sort of like thought on this is you think about the history of Houston. We have industries, major industries that are built on the backs of exceptionally risk diverse people. You have to be, right? Space, energy, healthcare, like you screw up, people die. Right. And so for generations, we've born, bred, imported a type of talent that has to sort of be risk adverse. Now, it's funny because there is definitely like the wildcatter side too. That's like, screw it. We'll go dump 1 million holes to drill a hole in West Texas and see if something comes up. Right.
Exactly.
Like there's that too, right. That I always temper this with and balance it with. But by and large, like I go back to this thesis of the types of startups that are going to be hypergrowth are the ones that are going to solve major problems. Those major problem holders are not the family offices that are drilling holes in West Texas. The problem holders are the hospitals, the energy companies, the logistics companies, the space companies, right? They're these big organizations that are really trying to wrestle with some of humanity's greatest challenges. And the people that hold those problems, that's the culture that needs to shift, right? And the people, the company, the industry, like I don't want to say it's just the individuals, but there is definitely a culture there that is still leans towards being very risk adverse and very much like we need to figure this out in our own R&D lab and spend years developing something, as opposed to like creating a skunk works that can go out and work with external innovation practices at a high level that can bring that stuff in and affect their innovation pipelines in a higher way. So
we need to get some of those companies to fund some of the people that are out there doing that, like venture studios and local venture funds.
And it's funny, right? Like when I hate to make this like these stark comparisons, but like when I travel around and we run programs in other parts of the world and other parts of the country, that is extremely common, right? It's extremely common to see 150-year-old organizations. One of our best partners in Boston is MassMutual, right? 140-something-year-old finance company, right? Like these are very old organizations that have done things the way they've done them for a long time, that have hit this moment of like realization that says we have to do better at finding things outside. I think the other, like I mentioned this earlier, the other problem that we've had is that Houston's economy has been so incredibly strong for so many years. Like we've never had an oh shit moment that has forced us to do something different. Closest we got to that, I think, was energy downturn, which I credit a lot to like the right time, right place for us to launch things like Houston Exponential and the HX Venture Fund and the Innovation District and all those things. But until we have like, I think either an awakening, a realization that something has to change, or there's this sort of like supervillain moment where everything like goes in the shitter, then we've got to like, it's going to be hard for that change to happen.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, in an odd way, we need a bunch of people to get laid off with 6-month severances because of some event that happened, so they can go out and start startups because they finally don't have to worry about quitting that well-paying job, and they can go and pursue their passion. That would be one scenario. I'd prefer just maybe more of an interest in people actually taking that leap,
absolutely.
Without having something terrible happen. But we'll see. So
I don't think, and I don't think like you don't want to wish those things to happen. But like I had a great mentor that would tell me, you never let a good crisis go to waste, right? Mm-hmm. And every time there's a big sort of crisis, energy downturn, financial markets, COVID, whatever, innovation, creation spikes through the roof. And there will be something that will change the way we operate, the way we communicate, the way work gets done in the very near future that I think will trigger that. And we'll see the need sort of meet the demand.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Hopefully we're not just a victim of our own success, right? So I think we can get there without that. But well, thanks for being on the show, Jon. It's a very interesting conversation. I think we have something for you here in the box. I like to wear socks. I've got like wet lab socks on today, but I got some rocket socks.
Love it. Yes.
There you go.
I love a good pair of socks. This is
Startup
awesome.
rockets. So.
I love it.
Houston rocket. It has multiple meanings, right? So
I love it. That's great. My wife will be appreciative. My sock drawer is overflowing. She already is annoyed by it. It's awesome. Thanks for having me on, man. This was so much fun.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here.